Final proof, final words. You've heard it said that when something goes in print, it must be true, right? Not that that's the truth, but you've heard the phrase. Well, Randy, I just want you to know that I plan on living longer than you do. And while not that I wish you dead anytime soon, but in my later retirement, I'm in a much better place. Because according to the newspaper today, the fellow that's speaking is Tim Lester Buckman. Yeah. So all I'm saying is the Buckman boys better be ready to split it 6 ways, not 5 ways. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah. I'll be over for supper. Like a lot of places, the Washington not Washington County Hospital anymore, but Meredith has upgraded their security system, and so they invited pastors over to go through their system so that you can have some limited access, but some access to make it easier for us to see folks in the hospital, know that they're there, kind of find out what's going on with them. But it's very secure, so everybody doesn't have it. So there's a protocol to go through. And so Randy and I and Trent went to that. And a part of that process is they give you, again, some limited access to computer-related things. And Tim Thorpe, you should know all about this, I would think. And so in the middle of all that, we discovered that you could put an app on your iPhone, and it gave you some access to patient care and so on. And you have to download all that information. Well, you don't know this about me, but I've taken it on as my personal goal in life. If I never do anything else, I'm going to do this, is technology is not going to beat me. And so I really don't want your help if you think you know what you're doing with technology. And so poor Trent got to be on the receiving end of that because he was there with us, and we're downloading things, and of course I'm going on like I know exactly what I'm doing, and I'm downloading stuff right and left. I'm totally on the wrong site. And I get into some site where you're sharing your personal information with everybody. Well, I just keep going until I run into something I don't like. So Trent is being really kind. I mean, he's being very gracious, and he says, now Tim, I think, where did you get that app? And maybe we, there's a different app you need to download. And I'm going, no, Randy's standing right there. No, I don't need your help. I want to try it myself. And I'm getting, I'm not totally unkind, but I'm just a little, I don't want your help. And then all of a sudden, after Trent tried several times to help me out, he just said, well, what about this? And Tim, is it doing this? And I just said, hey, I got this. I'm going to figure it out. I want to figure it out for myself. And he was pretty gracious to me. But then the words had to come out of my mouth. Perhaps I was wrong. I don't do wrong very well. How about you? Well, today, when we look at the final proof and the final words of Jesus, we're actually going to see Jesus in that position with these people that he's bringing his proof to. Now, last week, Randy talked to you about several appearances of Jesus. He went through them, and I hope you walked away understanding the amazing reality of how many different people saw Jesus. And the truth is Jesus is alive. We recognize that from all this information that we were given this last time. But for those of you that might possibly, maybe you haven't quite bought into the Jesus thing yet, and there's this sense, well, Randy kind of stuck with the Bible last week. Well, it is a church. But for those of you who'd like to do a little more research, there are resources outside the Bible that actually report that Jesus was seen. And these are historical documents that are definitely not from a Christian perspective. And there's certainly been some incredibly brilliant men for many years, MacDonald and Strobel and frankly a whole list of other people who've done quite a little bit of work to basically say this: when there's a report for something like that happens in our world, there has to be a reason for that report. And then basically the conclusion those two fellows those many really smart guys come up with is this, that Jesus must have arisen from the dead. It can be proven in a court of law. Now, if you say, well, Tim, surely you're not going there today. The good news is no, I'm not. But if you still have some question and you've kind of written off this whole Jesus thing because, well, they kind of have their own, book that they only follow that book and so on, recognize this. There's a lot of really brilliant people that never followed Jesus that set out to disprove that Jesus is alive that ended up naming him Lord in their life. Not the least of which was my biology professor at the University of Tennessee. So I want you to get that this hasn't been done in a vacuum, and nobody's checked their brains when it comes to Jesus Christ himself. But not only that, even though there are some that would accept all the beautiful things that are said in Scripture about Jesus and the fact of his resurrection, others would say, look, I know I got to see the proof. There's a lot of people that simply reject the reality of Jesus Christ for a lot of other reasons. And rather than speculate on all those, I just want to say this, that the reality of the resurrection and Jesus' prediction that people will be offended by the message of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that they'll be offended by that, is very present in my life. Here, this last Sunday afternoon, Easter Sunday, I had, at best, a weird experience. Secondly, a very frustrating and anger-invoking experience. I'd had a little bite to eat. I'm decided I'm going to just relax a little bit. I'm having a cup of tea. And I get a text from a person in my sphere of influence. And I'm not even going to get any closer than that because I don't want you trying to figure out who it was. Obviously, it's somebody that's in my contacts, and that texts me. And this is what they text me. I'm not making this up. I was going to put it up on the screen, but just decided to tell you. Happy Zombie Jesus Day. Now, I've told a couple of those guys out, as a couple of fellows that somebody told me that, in other places that I go that aren't quite like a church, and they go, huh, huh. Well, I wasn't going, huh, huh. I've got to tell you, it made me mad. Now, I'm not asking you to be mad. If you're sitting there saying, I don't even know why you got mad, okay, that's fine. But there was something in me, because you see, my personal interaction with this guy named Jesus who's real and alive has not been that he's some nasty-looking, stinking somebody that has no life in him and doesn't even have the sense to come in out of the rain. He's very real, and he's very alive. And so because of that, and my recognition that Jesus has dramatic impact in my life, a pretty quick response on my part was to simply text back this. Thanks for sharing. This Jesus you're talking about, I'm alive today literally because he's in my life. Now, I didn't go on to tell, but this person would know that there'd been a time in my life when I was so deeply depressed that fantasizing about suicide seemed like a really good idea. So you see, when I say Jesus is alive, and I'm alive because he's alive today, I'm not just talking about for the future in my resurrection. I'm alive today because Jesus did things in me that no other human being on this planet could do in the middle of great and dark times in my life. Are you following me? So if you're considering this thing about Jesus, you understand the reason I get just a little undone when somebody says, Happy Zombie Jesus Day. It stirs up a passion in me because of the reality of this guy named Jesus that's been a part of my life for such a long period of time. And then the person said this, yeah, in response to me saying I'm alive today because he's alive. Yeah, and he's eating your brains right now. Now, I'm assuming a few of you might find that incredibly offensive. I'm sure there's people out there that think that's just comical. But again, in me, I went from being, Mr. Spiritual, well, Jesus has changed my life, to, I want to kill you. Today's a good day to take you out. is what I was feeling on the inside. Of course, I was doing it in a spiritual way. I just wanted to lay hands on him. And but I recognize, thankfully, because there is a real Jesus and he lives in me, that there's something more. And so there was this internal struggle that began to happen within me, and what I would have you see in a few minutes where that struggle took me. But I want to go to the scriptures now and talk to you about my friend Jesus. Randy looked at the one thing I love. I just want you to adjust your lens, remembering all that Randy shared with you last week. And then I want to talk to you about who Jesus was as he gave the final proof of the fact that he was alive and that he had resurrected from the dead. Because I got news for you. I've benefited significantly more from who Jesus is, far more than any one thing that he did. Because who he is how he acts all the time. It's the core of who he is and how much love that he has in his life. And so what we're going to look at, go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 24. In just a minute, we're going to read verses 17 to 19. We're going to read just a few passages here today, or reference a few passages. Some of them I'll reference quickly, and they'll be up on the stage. But, excuse me, I want you to hear me. The final proof that Jesus was making that he had come back from the dead could not be separated from the person who he was. He did it in such an incredibly amazing way. And so if you're here this morning, you haven't decided whether or not you're going to do the connect with Jesus thing. You don't want to know if you want to have him part of your life. Or maybe you're not in a good place with Jesus. I want you to hear the kind of man he is. Because as we head into this story of the 24th, I feel like, now, Trent, I'm not saying you're Jesus, but I feel like that Jesus, in a much more significant way, ought to be just as frustrated as Trent had to have been earlier this week when he was trying to help me out with the technology. Because, see, Jesus had been with these guys for 3 years. The followers had been with him. They'd heard all that he said, and he taught them everything they needed to know. And now he's come back from the dead, and they're all grieving. We pick up the story. Luke doesn't cover all the different appearances, but the ladies have gone to the tomb, and now we come to the story, the road to the man, the two men on the road to Emmaus. And they're having a discussion about all that had gone on. And there's confusion, and there's fear, and there's doubt in their life. And in verse 17 to 19, it says this, and he asked them, what are you discussing together as you walk along? Jesus joins them in their walk. So Jesus has come back from the dead, the ladies have gone to the tomb, and now these men are walking along, and this is what they say. They stood still, their faces downcast, and one of them, named Cleophas, asked him, are you the only visitor in Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened there in these days? And Jesus says, what things? What things? And so the first thing I would ask you to see about Jesus in this, if I were Jesus, I'm not. If I were Jesus and I had just come back from the dead and I'd spent 3 years of my life pouring into people and they're not getting it, I would be pretty close to the edge of frustration. But I want you to get a peek in the way Jesus operates with you. When you're not getting it, he doesn't rush in like a bull in a china cabinet. He engaged these guys in an incredible way. And this is only the first part of the engagement, but he engaged these guys in an incredible way. He actually gave them an opportunity to download about their hurts, their fears, their confusions, all the things that they had believed about Jesus and back and forth, all the things, their dreams for the future, and they're talking, and we don't know what else might have been talked about, but at least recording what had unfolded and that Jesus had died, and you can hear the frustration in their voice. And the first thing I want you to hear about Jesus is he could have, in a very specific, in a very, very specific way, and he goes on to challenge them a little more, excuse me, to engage in them a little more. We'll see that later, but Jesus could have just flat out went, boom, I'm here. But he didn't do it. He took the time to enter into their world. And if there's anything that we need to understand and get a hold of as believers, is that Jesus Christ is not a bull in china cabinet, and he is not a bully. He desperately cares to recognize that what we think people ought to be along further in their relationship with him. And people ought to get it better. You know, they've made so many errors that they ought to be further along. Jesus Christ recognized, perhaps, I speculate, that he could have assumed they ought to be getting it by now. But he took the time to engage in them. And I want you to remember that. So that's the first thing I see from this story. Jesus was a patient guy that's willing to enter into the hurt and the fear and perhaps the disgust and the anxiety about what's to come. But secondly, very quickly, in Luke chapter 24 and verse 25, he says this. And so they shared all that they'd known and the angels and all of that. And some of our companions went to the tomb and they didn't find anybody. And Jesus turns to them and he says, so he's invested a lot of time with them. He's still walking with them, and he says this, how foolish are you and how slow of heart to believe all the prophets have spoken? Did not Christ have to suffer these things and then enter into his glory? This is interesting to me. Jesus would have not done well. That's not really. Jesus does well everywhere. But Jesus would not have done well with the PC crowd in our culture today. Yeah. Well, and all I mean by that is this. Nobody did better listening than Jesus. Nobody jumped to conclusions any less than Jesus. I mean, Jesus was a master at hanging with people and intersecting with their lives where they were at, so much so he was called a friend of sinners. And just like this tree from our program talked about, he hung out with sinners because he entered into their world. So on the front end, Jesus would be a rock star today in terms of the way to do life. You want to hear people's stories. See, that's the part. You hear their story. But here's where there would be a parting of the company. Jesus got to the place with the men that he'd so invested in, and he hears their story, and he hears their frustration, and then he begins, without yet revealing who he was, he begins to challenge what they already know. Now, what they already knew about the situation, what they knew about the teaching they'd received since they were children as the Old Testament, and how life was going at that particular time. And what he does is he calls them out to a very, very particular kind of a place, excuse me, and a place that says, how's life going for you? And what is it you know? And would you think with me here? Because I'm not sure all your thinking is going well. Now, I jokingly tell people, on occasion I go visit a couple places down around. One of them's a little Foster's place down here. And if you happen to go in about 2/3 of the way through happy hour, people have got enough in them that they don't feel so PC anymore. And so if you say something stupid, they go, well, that was really stupid. Well, I'm not suggesting everybody go get drunk to fix America so we can all quit being so PC. What I am suggesting is this. Jesus loved somebody enough to tell them if they stunk. He loved them enough to engage them and challenge them about the way things were going on with their life. These were his men, to get them to bring them to this place of understanding. We go on in the passage of Scripture, and we find the next thing Jesus does in verses 41 and 42. And so what ends up happening, before we go there, what ends up happening is Jesus is talking with these guys. They're so intrigued by the fact that he cared enough to hear their story, and he invested in them and cared about their hungers and their fears and their anxieties, and then finally said, hey, now listen, I understand all that, but what about this, and what about this, and what do you understand to be true? In other words, what's going on, what's the reality of what's going on in your life, and what's true and what's not true? And they were so intrigued with the fact that he didn't just roll over and that he had patience, but he was challenging them. They said, come on, let's keep discussing this. And then he went home with them, and he broke the bread, and he revealed himself to him. And then all of a sudden, they realized this was Jesus. So those guys go running, get with the other guys, and we come on to the scene now, excuse me, in verse 41 and 42. So Jesus enters the room. The guys thought they saw a ghost. And when they saw the ghost, and this is going to be... we're not going to read this passage. In 37 and 38, he says, they thought they saw a ghost, and they say, why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? He says, look at my feet. It's me, myself, touch me. A ghost doesn't have flesh and bones. And in beginning in verse 40, and leading into 41, he says, and when he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. In verse 41, and while they were still, still did not believe it because of the joy and amazement, he asked them, do you have anything for me to eat? Excuse me. And of course, what ended up happening is they gave him some broiled fish and he ate. So the first thing I'd suggest to you is that Jesus began to challenge these guys. And as he challenged them, he first of all challenged what their experience was. They experienced him with the two. There was this great revelation, and he broke bread, and they recognized that. Then he asked them to touch the nails, the nail prints, and the scars in his body. But then he asked them to experience even more as he moved along in verse 41 and 42. And then in verse 44, we see him say this. Excuse me. He said to them, this is what I told you, that while I was still with you, everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law, the Moses, and the prophets. Jesus now began to challenge their very heart. And what I'd like for you to just notice about this whole idea of the challenge is this. When Jesus starts revealing himself to you, and this is for people who maybe haven't decided to choose Jesus yet. Yes, he's going to care about what's happening to you, but he's going to start challenging the way you do life and the way you think. Unfortunately, for some of us, we'll find out that our mate was right, and we are. That's not today's sermon. But you get what I'm saying is he'll begin to challenge me, but with that challenge, first of all, he'll have me look at, by way of the leading, maybe using other people, the experience that I'm having. But then he'll start challenging, and I'll start asking questions internally in myself. And then finally, Jesus is going to do something very amazing, like he did with these men. He's going to reveal himself. In verse 37 through 40, an amazing, amazing thing happens. And we talked about how he revealed himself by way of showing him his scars, and then he challenged them with the thinking. Here's an interesting thing here. He says in verse 44, I referenced it before, that he says, all the things that were written about me in the law and the prophets, those things all had to come true. And then he says in verse 45, and he opened their mind so they could understand the scriptures. So Jesus engages people in a very specific way, but he's not going to just engage them. He engaged these men, and he will engage us. In the same way, he challenged them with what they observed going on, and certainly he wanted them to see he really was the living Christ, because there was something coming beyond this that he wanted to do them engage themselves in. But I want you to get that Jesus Christ was an engager. Jesus Christ was one who would challenge, and finally, he revealed himself to their minds and their hearts. Now, as you think about that, the last thing that I see Jesus talking about in this passage, in Luke chapter 20, verses 45 and 48, is this, 45 through 48. Then Jesus opened their minds so they can understand the scriptures, and he told them, this is what is written. Christ will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day. And repentance and forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are my witnesses. You are witnesses of these things, and I'm going to send you what my Father has promised. But stay in the city until you've been clothed with power from on high. The truth is Jesus not only engages people, cares about what's going on, he not only then reveals himself to them, challenges them, and then reveals himself to them. But finally, there's one last thing he does, and it's the challenge. He calls people. He calls people. In this passage, I could put it to you like this. Certainly, the appearances of Jesus finally and forever made a great communication that he was alive. But it was also the final proof of who he was. Jesus reaches into our world and into our life and draws us into this dialogue with him that makes us look at our life and make a decision. Now, if you're a person who is not a Christ follower yet, quite frankly, it's very simple. There's a decision for you to make in terms of where you'll go with him. We'll talk about briefly in just a moment. But with these men, he just didn't let it go that okay, I'm here, final proof. See, I was right, everybody else was wrong. No, he said, there's something more from here. And it's the whole point of it. You are my witnesses, and you have been called to be my witnesses to every nation on the planet. Now, this is where it gets a little unnerving, because quite literally, now Jesus' final proof is you. I'm going to repeat that. Jesus' final proof is you. As you live in this world with your words and your actions, with your words and responses, what ends up happening is the reality of how impossible it is to live in this world with all the offenders in the world and all the things that go wrong that are so incredibly devastating. The fact that you are making it, and you're making it well, in the middle of incredible, hard circumstances, is proof that the living Jesus still lives. And you're using your words, and you're using your life. Now, this becomes an incredibly important thing, because I don't get to just slough this off. You see, the danger from Easter Sunday is I end up relegating Jesus to some zombie walking dead man. But he's not. He is real and alive, and he moves and works in me, and there's no place that it's any more demonstrated when I get squeezed as a follower of Christ. And when I get to make the testimony that the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is not just a 2,000 year ago thing, but it's that he has now come and made residence in me. He lives in me, and because of that, I'm able to respond and live life full of life and in a way that honors the living Christ who saved me. So we go back to Tim and his little text war going on with the person who texted him about a Happy Zombie Jesus Day. And he said to me then, yeah, and he's eating your brains right now. And I'm telling you, I was a little mad before, but after that, I was insanely mad. And this was the self-talk that was going on inside me. You can't talk about my Jesus like that. Daggone it. Do you understand how, into myself, do you understand how offensive that is? I need to do something about this. And then this is what I realized. I'm sitting here in a safe little chair in my neat little house out in front of the building. And Jesus was on the receiving end of all of that. And he looked at him and he said, Father, forgive them, because they don't have a clue about what they're doing. That's who Jesus is. He does not have a passion that requires that he put you in your place. He has a passion to see that you get it. That's why he engages people and pulls them from their life experience. And yes, he makes a challenge to them, but he keeps showing up again and again and again, even to the point at the middle of the greatest offense that you're doing to them. So all of a sudden I was just broke, and I sat in my chair and I wept. And the only thing I could get out on the text is, this Jesus you're talking about loves you so much. And so do I. I got news for you. It's not a Tim Lester response. You don't mess with me or my family, and I'll take you out. But Jesus says there's another way. And so finally to close, I'd say it like this. If you are a person who hasn't chosen Jesus yet, I dare you. I dare you to start asking the kinds of questions, because Jesus is asking. He wants to know whatever doubt you have, all that. And so today for you, when we're going to have communion here in a minute, if you're willing to ask questions, and if you're like kind of embarrassed to come up here in the front, but if you'd like to say, look, I want to get my questions answered, there's a piece of paper up here anytime from now until the building closes. Put your name and your phone number on there, and I guarantee you I will call you, or I will make sure somebody does. Because if you walk out of here, if you don't understand, if there's not something moving in you, well, then blow the whole sermon off. But if there's something in you that says, yes, I need to engage this Jesus that's engaging me, be willing to let him challenge you. Secondly, this. If you are what I would call the coasters in life, those are people who are living off the faith of whatever came before. And I don't care what, sort of historic Christian background you came from, Catholicism or this or that or something else. You're just kind of living off of what you've been taught and the way you got brought up, and you're I'm good. I'm good. I did the church thing when I was growing up. Jesus is asking something from you. He's asking you to, in real life, make a decision whether or not you believe he came back from the dead. He's asking you to recognize there is a call on your life. And so if you're a person, either the first group or the second group, who has never said, I know what my sins are, and I'm wrong, and I need to be forgiven. And if you have never asked Jesus to forgive you and come into your life, today I want you to make that decision. I don't want you living off, I don't want you coasting off of some kind of faith you think you had from the past. Until you've made a personal decision to say, Jesus, I believe you rose from the dead. I believe I want your forgiveness, and I want you in your life the way you're in that goofball Tim Lester's life. Don't act like Tim Lester. Go get with the God who creates in Tim Lester something that doesn't exist. You see what I'm saying? And finally, those of you who are Christ followers, I want you to hear this. The final proof that Jesus is alive is you. So that means there is a world out there that requires you to start engaging them. And that means those nasty, ugly, hard to get along with people that you don't like being around. And it requires that you engage in their life and actually understand why they're doing all those, we don't say this to their face, stupid things that they're doing. For you students, and I don't care what school you go to, I hear stories about all the students, all the schools that our students go to. Like, for instance, one thing, and I'm not slamming on Grace, but one of the things I've heard about kids over at Grace, if you go to Grace, don't get all offended. I heard there's cliques over there, and everybody's shocked that there's cliques in a Christian school. And that some people have really been wounded by that. You're here, I'm not talking to everybody else. If that's a reality, the reality is that Christ has called you to be his life to people that are not in the cliques, but the ones no one will ever be a part of. Now, I could go on, pick on them, but let's pick on the adults for just one more minute and say this. Do you know that the church would be... I'm tired of church growth, procedures and plans and strategies and all that. I'm just tired of it. Jesus only had one plan. Go give testimony, go give witness, say to people with your words and with your life that Jesus is alive. Demonstrate the very life of Jesus in you. And oh, by the way, the great consequence of that is you're going to get hammered, slammed, and they're not going to like me any more than they like you. I pray that we get one thing from this Easter season. It is not enough for us to acknowledge that Jesus Christ came from the dead. He is not some walking zombie. He is a non-dead, alive creator of the universe who is dying and did die for the privilege to live in your life, to forgive you, and to have you pass out the love that he has passionately cared for others. If you are a Christ follower and you know you have not accepted the call to start engaging in this world in such a way that it radically transforms them, when you go to the tables this morning, I want you to go there and make that commitment to Christ. And honestly, I'd like for you to write your name down. I'm not even going to count how many people do it. I'd just like for you to write your name saying, I'm in. I am in. We're going to go to the tables now. The way we do communion here in Tri-State is we have tables on all four corners. We invite any Christ follower to come and participate in that. Do not miss today that Christ has called you to something and you're celebrating His very blood this morning. Do not count the blood of the covenant by which you were sealed as an unholy thing. Respond to Him in a way you've never responded before. You're free to go to the tables.